words, we talk about satisfaction, that Christ died for the satisfaction. That's answer. The idea that Christ died to satisfy the wrath and displaced honor of God. Right? That's. I mean, don't get me wrong. He's interpreting Scripture, but he's the one who gives us that term. So it finds its way even into our communion service even now. Our service tends to that whole prayer of consecration is meant to kind of cover every base and really make really clear what we're talking about. Which is one reason, actually, I heard someone say, and I think they're probably right, why our sermons don't have to be quite as long than, say, for instance, at a lot of sort of evangelical churches, a lot of Protestant churches, is because so much of our service talks about the sacrifice of Christ, talks about what it means to be a Christian, that it's kind of woven into the very fabric of it. So our sermons don't have to necessarily cover all that ground that you would necessarily. I try. I try. I know, and this can be a point of contention. The Archbishop puts it well. A lot of it depends on how good a communicator you are. Like, we've all heard those sermons where we thought, they were 12 minutes and they thought they were 30, and they were 30 and they thought they were 10. I've definitely experienced both of those. Father Wells always likes to say, and I think this is good advice, every sermon should feel like it's 18 minutes, whether it is or it isn't. I think that's a good way to think about it. That's always stuck in my mind. But yeah, so I think I do agree. I think ours are in a good space. But let's talk tonight about the actions of Christ within John chapter 1, verse 40. So we heard about last time we talked about the two disciples who came from John. And I didn't want to give away the whole bag yet, because we're going to kind of hear about them now. But they're not introduced with names at first. As a matter of fact, the second one doesn't get a name either, which we'll talk about why that is, and who that almost certainly is. But we look at verse 40. I remember, just as a small recap, remember we talked about that everything Jesus does here is significant in these early stages, right? And particularly the whole idea of him turning to face these two new disciples is the turning of God back to Israel. And I think that's why John doesn't give us their names up front, because he wants them to sort of fill that idea of this is Israel having its God turned back to them. So, the rest of the chapter is going to be about the calling of the apostles. Right? Now remember, we get different perspectives on this from the other synoptic gospels, right? They sort of tell a bigger story in certain parts that give us more information, like the calling of Simon, right? We have the whole story of Jesus preaches on his boat, and then he tells Simon, hey, go out and go get some fish. And Simon's like, Jesus, you may know a lot about preaching, but I'm a fisherman. We fished all night. But still, because that's when you fished at this time. You fished at night. It's like, but if you say so, we'll go out and we'll throw the nets, and they pull in all the fish. Simon immediately falls on his knees. John compresses that a lot in what we're going to see here, because it's a story that's already been told, right? I mean, that story's done. Let's move on. He's got different areas he wants to look at. So we look at the verse 40. One of the two who heard John speak. Remember, this John was John the Baptist, who said, look, there goes the Lamb of God. And the two disciples go. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. Again, we get a nice look at this verse in the Greek. And you see that it's front-loaded on Andrew, Andreas, right? Andreas. So Andrew, the brother of Simonos Petru, of Simon Peter, who's of the duo that had heard John and that followed Jesus. So this apoluthesis, the root of this is apoluthesis, which is follow, and followed him. And the him there is Jesus. So most translations will just put Jesus there to make it clearer who the him is, but the him there is Jesus. Right? Just clears the antecedent. So what we have here, the named disciple is Andrew. And Andrew is actually a Greek name. But that's not super uncommon here, because oftentimes, by this point, there's a lot of Jewish people who have Greek names. This is a thing that was just kind of happening. Ever since Alexander the Great conquered the Holy Land, you have the Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture, really just everywhere, right? We read about this specifically in the Apocryphal books, right? This is why it's a good thing to have these in your Bible, like we do. You notice it's not in these ESVs we have, because they're made by Crossway, which is a Protestant publication. But we've always maintained that having them in our Bibles is a good thing to do. So, for instance, King James Bible I'm always using has them in them.
The King James Bible has the Apocrypha.
It does, yes.
Really?
But remember, if you look at our articles are very clear about how one uses the Apocrypha, right? So this isn't a really super controversial thing until the time of the Reformation, when you have sort of Protestant reformers and Roman Catholic Church really laying down a sort of serious burden on these. But for instance, Jerome, who translates the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, as our articles tell us, if you look at the Articles of Religion, there's a specific article on this, which tells us that the apocryphal books, we keep them because they have historical value and teach us about what one might call manners of living, right? So it's really important for us to know that history between the last Old Testament prophet and Matthew, right? I mean, we really want to know what's happening there. So it makes sense to keep them in our Bible, but not make doctrine from them. Because there was always a distinction, and Jerome saw this when he went to the Holy Land, that there was always a distinction within the Jewish tradition of those books of being outside of the canon. Right? That was a common thing. And so the question is, then it becomes a big deal in the Reformation, where Trent, the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic Council says, no, 100%, they're canon. Luther and a lot of the Reformers say absolutely not. That's why they're not in those Bibles you have there. Where the Anglicans, we took a middle road on this and said, no, you can't make doctrine from them, but they're important for us to know. For instance, Jesus would have heard these, right? I mean, these are things we need to know, but we recognize they're not doctrinal. So that's kind of a helpful distinction. I think it's a really good one. So we'll even read them in our daily office, right? And you'll always notice, though, that in the lectionary I print out, that the books that are in italics, those are books of the Apocrypha.
Yeah, did you see this? It's familiar.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's going to be one from the Apocrypha, right? Right. So there's some really good, though, critical editions of the Apocrypha if you're interested in them. The Lutherans have actually a really good modern language critical edition with notes on the Apocrypha. It's actually really good. I highly recommend. But it's a good thing to know. It's a good thing to be familiar with. And there's beautiful things in there as well that are helpful for us. But again, not on the same level as the canonical books. So as I say, we've got this Greek name, which is an interesting thing. But it's taken for granted. You notice that the readers know who Simon Peter is, right? There's no explanation of who Simon Peter is. It's just kind of assumed. You would think that you would have some sort of writing about this, but you don't. All the verse says is, of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. Simon Peter's not even really introduced in it anymore, because everyone just knew who he was. I mean, Simon Peter at this point is known even outside of Christian circles. Peter's a known entity in the ancient world by the time John's writing. So he doesn't really, John the evangelist is writing, so he doesn't really need to explain much about who this Simon Peter is. But the other disciple, the second, is never introduced, right? The other part of the duo, right, is never introduced of the two. That the other one's not, which is interesting because this must have been intentional, right? I mean, because you feel it, like, wait, who's the other guy? You were even asking the question. Yeah. So, John knows that's the question you're going to ask, right? But he does this on purpose. And it's almost certainly because the other disciple is John, the evangelist, who's writing, right? So this is one thing, remember, throughout the whole book, John will never talk about himself. So he's always the disciple whom Jesus loved, the beloved disciple. And so here you have a disciple who's not named, and your immediately mind goes to, oh, this must be John. Why would John do this? I think there's a humility to it, that he doesn't want this book to be about him. He wants it to be totally about Jesus. But also, I think it's a literary technique as well, right? Because the anonymity of the character allows the narrator to focus in on how the character acts in relation to the main character of the story, which is Jesus, right? So he becomes, like, all of his actions are based upon the main character. So when we talk about the writer of this gospel, John, we talk about he's the beloved disciple, the one loved by Christ, the one who follows. It's all about what he's doing in relation to the main character being Jesus. So it's a neat literary technique that John's using here to make us keep us focused on Christ.
Yeah, it's like a mystery, but you're really wanting to go for it.
But every time you try to make it about John, you sort of bounce off, you ricochet back to Jesus. It's a neat characteristic of the book. We learn so much about the main character through how this anonymous character deals with him and loves him, right? His identity is all about Christ, right? And that's a beautiful, wonderful idea that he stresses in the book. All right, so let's take a look at verse 41. So this is Andrew. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. So, let's look at this verse here. Aristie ostos, so proton, the first thing he did was adelphoi, tell his own brother Simon, and tell him, unto lege. Here you have, we found the Messiah, Eurekama. So, you ever heard someone say Eureka?
Yes.
Right? Well, that's of course famously said by Archimedes. Excuse my ancient Greek. Sorry, but he's sitting naked in the tub. And off the top of my head, I can't even remember what. I think he discovered it was the buoyancy of the water, that when he went in, he displaced a certain amount of water, and he came up with that displacement is always going to be the same when a mass goes into water. And then famously he screams out, "Eureka! I have discovered it! I have found it!" and runs to the streets naked is the rest of the part. I don't know if that's totally what happened, but that's the idea. But yeah, Eureka! I've discovered it. So that you have this idea here. We have discovered the Messiah, right? That's what he's telling Peter. Archimedes sounds right, but I could be totally wrong. And it's a 2-second Google lookup, and then I'm never going to find out. That's all right. Well, I'll let them take me on faith on that. But, ancient Greek scientist, right? There you go. But I discovered it, and then you get this great term, mether menumo menon, which means this means, or you could say, it's another way of saying, it's almost like translated,
Here it's interpreted.
it's interpreted, which means Christ, Christos. So what's interesting here is that this Messian is a transliteration of the Aramaic, right? So the Aramaic, you would have said Messiah. And so John gives us the Aramaic word, and then he translates it for it in Greek, which is Christos, which is, of course, when we translate English, is Christ. Right? Which means that, John would have spoken Aramaic, right? He would have been from Judah, so sort of a Palestinian Jew, right? So he would know the Aramaic term, so he thought that was important to say. But also he recognized that within his audience, he'd also be writing to Greeks. So he translates what that Aramaic word means into Greek. And does anyone remember what Christos means? What do we mean when we say Christ? I mean, obviously we mean Messiah. But what does that mean? Because Messiah is an Aramaic word. Christos is a Greek word. Do we remember what it means? It's all right if you don't. What's that?
Christ-like.
Not Christ-like. It means anointed one, right? So, for instance, we think of kings were anointed, right, with oil. There's that scene where, if you've been reading Samuel, where David has the opportunity to kill Saul, and he says, "I can't strike the anointed one of God," right? And so he doesn't, even though Saul's trying to kill him, right? They still anointed today. You're absolutely right. Elizabeth I was anointed with holy oil. Excuse me, both. Well, they both were, but you're absolutely right. Elizabeth II now, yes indeed, yes. 500 years between them, right? But still, yes.
But
It's still. It certainly will be with either Charles or William. We'll see. Though I got to say, Megan was saying that in the pictures of I don't think it was the royal wedding. I think it was something later. Charles was standing next to to Elizabeth II, and she looks a little better than he does. I don't know. She may outlast him. Those. She is, yeah.
When she goes, goes down steps on the sisters. It's amazing how she does that, because I got to it now. I had to hold on to something.
Yeah, I know. She's her mother lived to be.
Yeah, 102 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah. So indeed, good genes, I guess. But yeah. So I think that's a neat little treat we have there to kind of see that who the audience is. First of all, we learned something about John, that he would know Aramaic and Greek, which makes sense with who he would be in this time period, in this world, and also tells us a little bit about the audience for the book, right? That it's not just for what we call sort of locals. It's also a book for people who speak Greek. It's a book for Gentiles too, right? Because remember, at this time, Greek is the main language of the Roman Empire. Latin hasn't taken over yet in the Western Empire. There's some Latin, but it's pretty limited. Greek was the language, right? One could argue that God chose this time period because you had, for the first time, the world connected with one language. Which, if you were going to make a book about the Messiah and then promulgate it to the world, it's useful to have one language, right? That's when we kind of figure out, like, why would Jesus come during the reign of Caesar Augustus? It's because in the reign of Caesar Augustus, you had a peculiar time of peace and by the sword. I mean, that's how Caesar Augustus made peace, by killing a lot of people. But you also had a peculiar time of connectivity of the ancient world. In some ways, we really didn't even get that again until some would argue to the dawn of the internet. Was the next time we had that kind of continuity and connectivity in the whole world. So, interesting thing to consider. All right. So, let's look at verse 42. He brought him to Jesus. This is Andrew brought Simon Peter, to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. All right. So, a few things here. So they bring him to Jesus, and Jesus says to him, "You are Simon, the Huios, the son of Ienu, of John." Different John than all the Johns we've been talking about so far, right? Lots of people named John, just like there's lots of people named Mary, right? Interestingly, Simon is one of the most common names in the Jewish ancient world at this time. But this is a different John. This is John, the father of Simon. So Jesus is basically calling him by his biological name, right? You're son of this person, son of that person. So, a few things here. And also, Petros is the name he gives him, Cephas. Petros, of course, is the Greek term for this that we see here. But we'll talk a little bit about what that means, what Petros means. And we'll also look at... Yeah, it does, right? It says rock, right?
It says a stone.
Stone, yeah. So we'll talk about what that is. Yeah, no, it's not. In the ESV, they just go with Peter. They just say it means Peter. We'll talk about why the ESV might have made that choice in a second, okay? But we'll get there. This is a really interesting verse. This verse, please. Oh, no, you're right.
If Jesus was being going to a different city.
Mm-hmm.
At about the same time, he's meeting all these people. And like you said, there's a lot of Simons.
Sure.
Would he have to say Simon,
Son of John? Well, I mean,
one of them?
you get kind of, I mean, you get kind of this, we get a sense of this because we all have last names, right? So this kind of solves this problem a bit. So it's easier for us to kind of determine who we are. But this kind of operates in that kind of way, based on who your father was. So you would say Simon, son of John. But you get the same idea when you get, when John will talk about the different Judases. He'll talk about Judas Iscariot and Judas not Iscariot. It gets a little bit confusing sometimes, but you kind of know who you're talking to, and adding on that specific, as I say, sort of biological marker, right? But we'll talk about why Jesus would change his name. We'll talk about that in just a second.
Even here, if someone were just reading the Bible, they really would saw John. They might, if they're reading it, then they think it's one of the Johns we're talking about.
It's helpful to have. I mean that if we're in the original context, this is clear because these people were famous to some extent, right? Particularly even outside, like Simon Peter. But it's also kind of given the ages. I suppose we're kind of meant to just kind of figure out that it's not the son of John the Baptist. They'd be contemporaries. That'd be odd. And also you would tell us that John the Baptist had a son named Simon, right?
I'm just thinking of someone
just picking it up, right?
And never having had,
and never had a drink. Well, I mean that's why. That's a great endorsement for why we study the Bible together. Yeah, I know. I don't feel so bad for people when they just sort of let loose and just I hope it all works out. It's good to be able to ask that.
It's a good start hoping that they'll say want to seek and know more.
No more, right. Yeah, the Bible is meant to be studied in groups in the church. Don't get me wrong. I think everybody should be reading the Bible every day and then come and bring questions and ideas and thoughts to the church body. This is the space because it's easy because you can just ask that question and go different John. They're like, okay, they just keep on moving, right? That's much easier than you're worried about it. Anyway else, yeah, different John. It's helpful. Every time Andrew is mentioned, I don't want to skip right by Andrew because that's so easy. But let's talk about Andrew just for a second. Andrew, of course, St. Andrew, we may know as the patron saint of Scotland. Right? So you've ever seen on, for instance, the Union Jack, but or Scotland's flag for that, the flag you see the cross of St. Andrew, which looks like an X, right? And of course, St. Andrew has an X-shaped cross because traditionally he was crucified on an X-shaped cross. So you'll sometimes see depictions of him. There are lots of different ways one can get crucified. Some creative ways. Peter, of course, is traditionally for being crucified upside down. The story is that he refused to be crucified as his Lord was. He didn't feel himself worthy, and so he asked to be crucified upside down, which would have also been horrible and terrible. It's a pretty horrible thing. There's no good way to get crucified. So that's St. Andrew is an important figure. Let's talk for a second, too, about that Andrew, whenever he shows up in John's Gospel, is always leading people to Christ. So here you have he's leading his brother, right, to Christ. You also have the same thing in chapter 6, verses 8 through 9. You get that same vision. Look at that together. Open up to John 6:8 real quick. John 6:8, which is a little bit farther ahead. So he says, this is one of the feeding the 5,000. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What are they to so many?" So he leads the boy to him, right? And remember, Jesus takes the boy's lunch and uses it to feed 5,000 people, right? And then you have the same thing in chapter 12, verse 22. Which is on page 996. Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them. Go back to 20, this makes it a little bit easier. Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we would see Jesus. Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. So they bring these Greeks who want to see Jesus to him. So, Sir, we would see Jesus is, of course, a famous thing. Every now and then you'll see pulpits have that on them. So that every time a priest goes into the pulpit, the thing that he sees is the line, Sir, we would see Jesus. And it's to remind the preacher that his job is to show people Jesus and sort of fulfill that role of Andrew. So, and I think that's a good thing to remember for all Christians, how important it is to lead people to Christ. In this case, Simon Peter becomes an incredibly important apostle. I mean, we would of course, it's often been argued, sort of the chief of the apostles, partly because of his age, probably because of a lot of things, but being the one who's kind of the first among equals of the apostles, right? And so that happens, though, because his brother leads him to the Lord. Despite the fact that Andrew doesn't have everything figured out, he doesn't know all that's going on. All he knows is, we found the Messiah, brother, come along, we have to go follow him. So he brings him along on his journey. I think that's such a beautiful picture of sort of the Christian going out in the world and bringing people to the church. Even though we don't have it all figured out, right? I mean, even a person who doesn't have, I mean, Andrew has almost none of this figured out, right? I mean, he's just starting on his journey, but it's still, he's grabbing people and saying, come on, you have to go follow this guy.
Sounds like he should be
Yeah. Well, I mean, but there's a sense in which that's not his ordained job, right? That's not his responsibility. That comes with a price. But so then we have this neat meeting between Jesus and Peter, right? Which is described in other places, but here is a neat one. So the story we have, we'll look at that in a second. Let's start off here. So the meeting between Jesus and Peter is marked by sort of an intensity, right? So we have that same word, ambelephos, right? This Jesus stared at him. Remember last time we saw that same word was when John the Baptist stared at Jesus as he came towards him, right? He stared intently at him. So Peter comes up to Jesus and Jesus sort of stares at him. And if you can imagine being caught in the stare of God, right? I mean, that how intimidating that would have been. Or I don't even know if intimidating is the right word, because Peter doesn't seem intimidating, but it's just massive. Yeah, it's just a massive thing to be caught in that, in the Creator's gaze. And he says to him, again, I told you he uses his biological name. Simon was the most common Jewish male name at the time. So a lot of Simons, right? So I think he calls him again by that sort of that, almost like a last name. So Simon, son of John. And it was very common in the communities around this period to be kind of known by your father's name, right? We still get some of that now, where like the kid will be known by his dad in a neighborhood, right? Oh yeah, you're Jimmy's kid, right?
My husband's father's name was William Ben Horrick, and that's Ben meaning the son of.
The son of, right, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. That's a very common thing. You can work that other way, right? Yeah, no, indeed.
But in those times, though, when they're saying the name, be it Andrew or Simon or Peter, it's referring to the house, isn't it? Their house.
In this case, it's referring to them in particular, right? Particularly if they aren't married or they don't have connections or anything like that. I mean, they're sort of, Simon almost certainly was married. We hear about him having a wife, at least a mother-in-law, right? We do. Jesus heals her, his mother-in-law, right? So he has a mother-in-law, has a wife. The wife isn't mentioned, which is fascinating, right? So we don't know whether it's possible she had died. That's a possible thing. But I think we have to remember when these men leave everything and follow Jesus, they really leave everything and follow Jesus. And that may have been part of it. It isn't specified, but that may have been part of it. So when we look a little bit further, though, there's a sense in which Jesus knows another name that belongs to Simon. So he sees him and he gives him a new name. And Petros, of course, means rock or stone, right? It's a play on Petra, which also is an idea. So we'll talk about what John doesn't say here and what John does say here. I think saying, Petros means Peter, like the ESV does, it's kind of like defining a word by giving the word again, right? I mean, the synoptic gospels tell us why he calls him Peter, right? Why he calls him the rock, right? Why he calls him the stone. So let's look really quickly at Matthew 16:18, which is where we see this happen. So Matthew 16:18. And again, Jesus could have definitely called him the rock on multiple occasions, or kind of recast him as this. But he calls him this in Matthew 16:18, which is, I'm sorry, I should give you the page. It is on 9:11. 9:11. So down at the bottom right, the section is called Peter Confesses Jesus as the Christ. Right? So on page 9:11. So the whole thing, Jesus said to them, this is verse 15, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So you have a little note there on the bottom page that says the Greek words for Peter and rock sound similar. So Jesus is it's a play on words, which Jesus will do, right? So he's calling him Peter because he's calling him the rock, right? Which is, I think, the ESV kind of, for polemical reasons, doesn't call him rock. And so he says, "And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So John doesn't give us all those details. He just gives us the details that Jesus called him the rock, or the stone, the rock. This wouldn't be a big deal if there are certain possibilities for what Jesus means by this. You'll sometimes hear Protestants say that, he was saying that his faith is the rock in which he's building the church. That doesn't make a lot of sense given the way Jesus says it, right? The reason that's often said is because the argument you often hear for the infallible papacy of the Bishop of Rome, they say it starts here, right? And so in Roman Catholic theology, and I can't, that's a big idea. There are lots of people who say lots of different things in Rome. But the idea is that there's a germ of an idea that grows into something. So Jesus doesn't say to Peter here, "Oh, by the way, you're the infallible head of an international church, and you have universal authority in every single parish." Right? He doesn't say that, right? Which is what we mean now when we talk about the Pope. But again, that's a pretty new idea in that full sense, right? I mean, it's not really deemed officially infallible until 1850. A lot of those things kind of grow. 1850. So a lot of those things kind of in the First Vatican Council, right? So a lot of those things kind of grow out of it. But what the argument is that it starts there and kind of grows. We don't put a lot of faith in that argument, right? We find that to be a bit fishy, so to speak. Not to talk about the fishermen that way, but a little bit fishy there, right? But what we should notice here, though, is that that Christ is saying that the foundation of the church is the apostles. It's the chief apostle, right? Which is Peter, right? That makes 100%. That makes perfect sense of what we're talking here. That makes sense of what we hear about the apostles throughout the rest of all the books. That the apostles are the foundation of here of the church, and from them that the whole church will be built upon. Makes perfect sense of what we're seeing here, and you don't have to sort of try to jerry rig kind of modern ideas about what the Bishop of Rome is supposed to be, right? So again, but the ESV sort of overreacts, I think, because again, it's a Protestant translation and kind of goes, well, it just means Peter. Don't worry about it. Like, don't worry about what Peter means. It's like, well, okay, I get that, but it means rock, right?
One time, the difference between, I don't know, means little rock.
Sure.
Another word that means large rock.
Well, but it's a
little rock.
yeah, but it's kind of, but again, it's almost certainly Jesus doing a play on words, calling him, the little, the rock, the little rock. I mean, that it's the idea that he's kind of. But I think when you look at the context of Matthew, and then what he says after that on this rock I'm going to build the church, right? I think it makes perfect sense of understanding the apostles and the profession of faith that he's just said as an apostle being the important thing. Remember, in just a few, like the next chapter, if I'm not mistaken, Peter says to Jesus, "I won't let you die on the cross." And what does Jesus call him? He says, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? Now he doesn't call him Peter Satan, but he's saying that impulse to stop the Son of God from dying on the cross is satanic, right? So again, you have to be, I mean, it really matters the where you are in that, and I think reading into that a modern institution is just wrong with peril.
And rock being the foundation.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's the best way to do it. And that way you don't have to kind of pretend that he's not saying rock, because he is. But you also don't have to say, well, of course, rock means Pope.
Yeah,
Obviously.
right.
Are you? I mean, that also no. Again, that's not what anybody says. What they say is, well, reasonable people say that it's a germ of an idea that grows over
Was
time.
there a Pope Peter?
Well, I mean, the argument is that he was the first bishop of Rome,
Okay.
which is almost certainly true. Probably, most likely, right? But he's killed, right? It's also fascinating to know how much time did he spend actually in Rome. It's really hard to know. But again, we're perfectly fine. We are absolutely perfectly fine with talking about the hallowed ancient tradition that Peter was the first bishop of Rome. 100% there, got it. But the argument that equals in the modern papacy is one that we're not keen on, right? And I offer that humbly, right? I think we should be humble about these things as best we can be, but that's just not there in the text, right? But I think the overreaction is also bad. To just pretend like it doesn't mean rock, but it means rock, right? That's bad. That's not a good idea. That's an overreaction to try to stave off just what I would argue is just kind of a bad argument. It's not. We don't have to do that. We just kind of go, yeah, it's a rock. It makes sense. He's an apostle.
Bishop basically is the Bible.
Right.
That title is not.
No. I mean. So the idea is that he's father, kind of concept of the church, kind of idea. But the idea of him being vicar of Christ, that's also not there either. There are a lot of titles in there. And again, they would argue that these are things that developed over time. We're very wary of that kind of an argument, right? I think we are perfectly fine with having our bishops as being the apostolic safeguard against heresy, right? That's 100% there. But when you start talking about there's sort of one super bishop over them, it just starts to get to be a bit hard to control, a bit hard to nail down. And again, that's a whole different argument. My only point is that's not what anything says here, right? It's not what anything says. Right? And John obviously doesn't think this is a huge deal, right? Because he doesn't even tell us about this, right? About that whole meaning behind the rock, right? Because the point here is Jesus, not Peter, right? Because Jesus is the one giving names, right? And to give someone a name is to have authority over them, right? Think of what Adam's job was at the creation. His job was to name all the animals, because by naming all the animals, he had power over them. That's why it's a big deal when Moses asks for God's name at the burning bush, right? And God kind of tells you, my name is the I am. It's the idea that you have that name. That's why, for instance, when the Jews went into captivity in Babylon, they stopped saying the name of God because they didn't want the heathen Babylonians to say the name of God, to say the I am, the Yahweh. So they stopped saying this. They started saying Adonai, right? That's why our Bibles have Lord in big letters, like it's all capitals. That's Adonai. And they started copying it as Adonai so that the Babylonians wouldn't even know the name of God, his personal name, right? The name he gave Moses as a sign of who he was to give the people. So names are really, really important. And also, for instance, you have examples within where when a powerful king would take over a land, he would change the name of the king who was there, who was now his vassal, who was now the puppet king, right? So we give him a new name. Like this happened like Zedekiah. When the Babylonians put him in charge of Israel, they gave him the name Zedekiah as a way of showing their power over him, right? But you also...
The same way in Daniel when you named it.
Right. So you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? I mean, those are their Babylonian names, right? You get the same thing too in Genesis when Jacob wrestles with the angel of the Lord, right? At night, and this is a fascinating story because it's a theophany. I mean, this is God wrestling with Jacob, and they wrestle, and by the end of the day, God gives him the new name. He gives the name Jacob, right? That's how he gets that name. Israel. He gets the name Israel in that case, right? He has a new name, right? It means one who wrestles with God, right? But right, so you get it's a really neat turn of events. You'll see this over and over and over again, where God changes people's names. Saul of Paul, another great example, right? Of where God changes someone's name. So Abram to Abraham, right? There are lots of examples of this where God changes people's names. I mean, this is a way of Jesus to look at Peter and declare him his disciple, right? And so he's coming down the road, and he comes up to him and declares and changes his name. Like, you're mine. Well, you get your own official name change. Well, I mean, we have our, for instance, your baptismal name.
Yeah.
Like, so the name that you give to your baptism, sometimes that's your name that you have. I mean, you call it a Christian name, right? They're your rebirth name, right? That's your regenerate name, right? And that's connected in there, right? Because your parents are acting. Well, if you're a baby, right? Your parents are acting as your stewards, as your guardians for God. So that's a kind of a neat thing we see in here, and there's a sense with I love this that Peter's doesn't really know what he's getting into, right? He's sort of just walking to see who this person is, right? That his brother has told him is the Messiah, and he's like walking up, and Jesus says, "You're mine. You're mine now. I just changed your name. You're now my disciple." Right? And I go, "What?" And that's it, right? So there's a sense in here which we sort of see it's kind of a microcosm of salvation in this, right? Where Andrew tells his brother about the Messiah, and he goes to see who this person is, and then the Messiah just claims him as his own, right? Christ just makes him his. There's no getting out. There's no escape clause. And there's a sense in which that name change shows a new man, right? He's a different person. Right now as a disciple of Christ, right? Simon Peter, yeah. But he's telling you how he kind of got that name, right? Because he was Simon, and then Peter was the name he got from Jesus. So what's interesting is he starts off by calling him Simon Peter because he's fake, because he's everyone knows who Peter is. Right? So he's going to let them know if you may not have ever heard the Simon name, right? And so he gives you that, and then he says, oh, by the way, this is how he got that name. Jesus made him his disciple, and called him Peter, right? I mean, here, Peter's important in this story, but the really important person is Jesus, right? Because every disciple he's going to call here are all overwhelmed by him in a sense, right? As we read in the gospel this evening, where he tells him, I chose you, right? When he's talking to the apostles in his farewell discourse, right before he's taken and murdered, he's, you're my friends. I've chosen you. I no longer call you servants. You're my friends. And I've chosen you, and you will fall away. It can't happen. Remember, that's coming in John's Gospel. That's John 15, so that's a little bit of ways from where we are. But that's that same sense we get where Jesus is totally in control of the situation that's around him. John really wants us to get that. Because remember, this is the Logos, this is the Word, this is the Creator of the universe who's come down. This isn't just some guy. Right? Now he's fully human, but he's still that Logos, the divine Word. And so he looks at you and says, you're mine now. You're his. That's it. That's how it goes.
See, now he's going to make me cry. Because, see, that's what Jesus is calling us.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Overwhelmed.
Exactly.
Just like he
100%. Yeah, I mean, that's you've nailed it. You've nailed why this seems kind of like a pedestrian story. Like, okay, Andrew tells his brother, and they go and see Jesus, and Jesus says, "You're mine now." But it's really important because this is how salvation happens, right? We're brought to Christ, and He claims us, right? I think that's a really key idea. We can't miss.
That's what happened to C.S. Lewis. I think he said, he's taken me.
Yeah. There's a sense of it. Exactly right. I mean, his what's the name of his book about his conversion?
Is it joy?
It's not joy. It's going to come to me in a second, anyway. No, that's a beautiful, beautiful story. It's how he struggled with that for so long, and then it just suddenly it was done. It was over. But again, you can make that argument that the final push he had was from a friend, right? It was from the great writer, his friend J.R.R. Tolkien, who just wouldn't let him get away, and just kept constantly. One might say badger, hounded him, right? But he was his Andrew.
Yes,
right?
That's exactly what
Right? When you think of so that's why Peter gets all the press here, but Andrew's really, really important, right? In this sense, he's the one who brings Peter to him. So a great thing about looking at these verses, kind of slow it down and see it is you see so much what John is trying to get us to see it, because it'd just be so easy just fly right on by that and get to when it's the good stuff happening. The good stuff is happening even in something that's as small as seemingly as that. It's a fantastic thing. Every single word, every single idea here just bears scrutiny and seeing. All right, that's 8 o'clock. Any questions? Any questions of what we got tonight?
I was just thinking in terms of, like you said, go slower and everything like that. But like you said, we can think of the kingdom of heaven. It's already started.
Oh, sure.
See, and so it's going to be eternal. So it doesn't matter how slow we go. It
No.
doesn't matter
No.
how long it takes. We'll have forever.
And right, exactly right. So that I always like to stress that when we're studying scriptures, particularly in this class, right, where we're taking our time, is that there's so much to see. You really, there's no rush. There really isn't. And it'd be a shame to run by that story like that and not really think about it. What is John trying to get us to see here? There's a neat thing about John's gospel, as I say, is he's already got the other gospels as kind of a reference point, so we can kind of go in different directions and show us different things. So it's a sort of curated historical look at the Jesus event. It's a fascinating thing to consider.
I just don't know how you learn all. I just don't know how you learn that Greek.
Oh,
It's just something
well, I had some really good teachers. That was helpful. I had some really good teachers, and it was it's.
This is over what period of time? Was it a few years? 4 or 5? What was it?
No, it was over a couple years. Period of time. But I mean, and that's one thing I stress. I tell people this all the time. Like sometimes people say, "Well, is a seminary education worth it? Is it worth it to go to seminary?" And it's worth it if the school you're going to teaches you how to read. Teaches you how to read Greek and Hebrew, right? So that's a really important thing for learning, for studying the Word of God. It opens up all sorts of fascinating, beautiful things to see, and it gets you as a professor of mine used to like to say, that like handling the scriptures in a translation is like handling the love of your life with gloves on. So it says if you want to take the gloves off, you got to learn the original language. And so my job is not everybody has time to devote a couple of years to learning Greek, right? So my job is to open this up for people so they can feel it and see it too, so to be able to take their gloves off for a minute and handle it, right? But that's I think that's a great thing about why we study the Bible together as a church and a community. And that's why a big reason why I'm here is to be able to let people handle it. Well, for instance, at Lindisfarne Hall, the school I told you about in Amelia Island, their students learn Greek.
Was that one?
Right, and so for instance, they have Greek class all the time.
Which is harder to learn, Hebrew or Greek?
They're different. They're harder in different ways. The Greek grammar is very hard to learn because it's you can throw words anywhere in a sentence based on case ending, and you just have to kind of determine it, right? Whereas Hebrew is right to the left, and it doesn't use an alphabet that looks like ours, and it has no cognates because it was built to be written on stones. So if you're writing with stone, it's easier to go right to left than left to right. It's just the ancient theory. And so it's right to left, but it's got a structure, so it's usually the same. You always know the verb is usually the beginning, subjects are the middle, and objects at the end, so that's helpful. Whereas Greek is just kind of all over the place. But again, they're different in different ways. They have their own unique challenges. But Greek is I learned Greek first, and I'd probably argue I like Greek more, but if I'm honest, maybe it's a first love kind of thing. But Hebrew is also fascinating. I end up using Greek a lot more just because we end up talking about the New Testament a lot. But having Hebrew is so useful for being able to look at the Old Testament and study and understand it.
The Yiddish communities have been in the news lately?
I haven't noticed that, no.
I wasn't aware that these communities are so isolated. The children, they're only spoken, they only teach them in Yiddish. They don't even know English.
It's fascinating. No, I'm not super familiar with this.
I understand parts of it. They don't want to have so much of the world.
Well, I think that's this sort of like, isolationism is one of those sort of pejorative terms, right? Right. But I look at, like I say, I keep using Lindisfarne Hall as a very positive example of school, where they have a very specific goal for their students. They want their students to be knowledgeable Christians, but they want them to be Christians first. And so teaching Greek is, so when they're studying and translating, they're literally translating the Word of God every night. And it's a great thing because, again, when you study Greek, you learn all sorts of cognates to English. So you learn all sorts of roots and prefixes and suffixes that help you in English along with it. And it's an excellent mental exercise. The same can be said for learning Latin as well, which is sort of one of the controversies, I say controversy, one of the big questions between different types of classical schools, which is what I very much like to start here. It's a classical Christian school, is whether one teaches Latin or Greek. There are good arguments for either side, but the advantage of teaching Greek is that you literally teach young people, how to read the language the New Testament is written in, which is really kind of cool. And if you know Greek, you can also read the Old Testament in Greek too, because the Septuagint is in Greek as well. So it's an interesting idea. I'm still researching. I'm still learning.
I think that school.
The classical school is building.
I think they even teach that.
I think they're going to do Latin,
Yeah.
is what as I understand it, and that's probably the majority opinion is Latin. I think some of that there was more people in that world speak Latin than Greek, so I think there's kind of that aspect of it too. Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be a really I think that's going to be a really good thing. I hope that goes well. I hope that they're insulated somewhat from all the stuff. It does. No, they're doing a very good job. Yeah, you should drive by it. It's a very, 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 very good looking building. So as I say, I don't foresee our school as being in competition with that at all. I think our job is, we're going to be, start much smaller and have a much different kind of idea of what we're looking at. I think that the big difference we can offer is that since we aren't connected to the state, we can offer a Christian education as well. So that's again, all day long, if someone asks me would I prefer if someone go to a classical school rather than a traditional public school, I'd say go to a classical public school. But I think that we can offer sort of a full-fledged Christian education.
Would you consider that under that Anglican umbrella that they're under up there in the it's an Anglican